Madam President, fellows and guests, it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Goodfellow, someone who I've known politically for close to 50 years. Following the LLB and MBA route, Peter had a successful career in law and business with substantial interests in fishing, agricultural trading, manufacturing and finance. His philanthropy is well known, especially in supporting medical research in Auckland. Peter is a political animal who practices what he advocates. A long-term National Party member, commencing with Young Nationals, who did the hard graft through the electoral campaign organisations until he was elected to the party's board in 2006 and became president in 2009. A political party president is responsible for the non-parliamentary organisation of a political party. This includes staff and volunteers. She is responsible for the selection of candidates, ensuring the party organisation is in peak fighting form at election time and at by-election times, and always ensures there are, this is the key, sufficient funds. Most of the work is silent. It is putting out fires and ensuring the party leader is advised and supported. Peter is a member of caucus as of right and has worked closely and successfully with three leaders, Sir John Key, Sir Bill English and Simon Bridges. In its 83 years of existence, the National Party has been very fortunate with its presidents. Some, such as Sir Alec Mackenzie up in Auckland, Sir George Chapman, were right up there, were clearly successful. I place Peter up there with similar or even higher markings. Peter, over to you. Prove it.
Thank you. With a mouthful, I'm reminded. One of the great advantages of having this relatively tight group of whānau is that we get involved in some very interesting conversations. So I think Stuart has just reminded us that a Chatham House rules discussion today would be a useful thing for all of us. Thank you, Stuart. Over to you, Peter.
Great.
Do you want the mic or do you want the video on?
I think we can just choose to use it or not.
Edit out some of those bits. Look, thanks very much for such a warm welcome and personal welcome, James. And yeah, our friendship goes back a long way, although always tinged with a bit of rivalry because we came from different areas of the country. And politics is about geography, ideological and other differences. And thank you, President Denise, for your support here and for the whole club, I guess, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I was actually with Simon Bridges on Thursday and Friday of last week in Australia, and we were discussing what we were doing on Monday once we'd come back, and he said, "Oh, I spoke at the Rotary Club last month." And he said, "Oh, you'll find them quite enjoyable." And I thought, well, hang on, if he's already spoken, I better take all those political things out that I said, that I was planning to say, because he's already covered those off. Not much has changed, if you like, in the last month. But look, I thought I'd just start by sharing some of the stuff that we saw in Australia, and it'll take just a minute. But basically, we had a small team go to talk to the key members of the campaign team for the Liberal National Party coalition, which won the election over there that was held in May. So just very recently, and they're still recovering from that campaign. One of the people we spoke to was going on leave for 5 weeks the next day, and he said that's the first leave he's taken in 3 years. Scott Morrison was fantastic, though. We got to spend an hour with him, and his advice, and with his advisors, his political advisor and his chief of staff. And his advice, when I asked him, was lead by example, and that's exactly what he did. And I think that captured the imagination of the Australian voters. The budget over there set the scene, and then the campaign really was about economic growth. And I think one of the people we spoke to said really actually Labor more lost the election than Scott Morrison won it, because Labor put out too many policies, too many ideas, and it scared people. They were uncertain about what Labor was going to do and how they were going to pay for it. So, you come back to some simple stuff in politics, and Australia's a great example for us, I think. for the National Party. I mean, they've been trailing in the polls for years since their leadership spills and infighting and all of that. And actually, their counterpart to myself, I met the federal president, and he said they didn't deserve to win because of the lack of unity and lack of loyalty in the caucus room. He was very frank about that, and yet they won the election that they couldn't win. And Scott Morrison, I think, is really going on with a great vision for what Australia can become, and it's just around that. So, it's in less than a year from now, and I'm sure Simon may have said this, we'll be starting our 90-day campaign, and anything can happen in the year between now and then, and in those 90 days. And the one thing I do know from the campaigns I've been in, under MMP, everything is going to be close. There's no such thing as an MMP election that is you can definitively say before time these people are going to win, this is going to be the government. You just simply can't, and it's been true since 1996. And so I leave that with you just as a general thought. So everything that we do is really clouded in that sort of uncertainty. And just picking up on James' point about my history in the party, yes, I came out of the university, I went into the University of Auckland and found a whole bunch of people who were interested in politics. This was before Muldoon's era, and then I became the chair, the Young Nationals chair for Rob Muldoon and his electorate, Tamaki, which was a fantastic experience. He wasn't at all interested in what policies we had. The only people who were really interested, and we'd go down to conferences in the 70s and end up on the first item or the second item on the 6 o'clock news on Saturday. James, you probably remember this. And I'd get home and my mother would go, "Oh, I saw you on TV again." Because, of course, we were pushing social issues. We were interested in the environment before climate change, but mostly then it was water quality, or the dying of the lakes, of the Rotorua lakes or something. So, times change, but actually the stuff that young people do doesn't necessarily change. I think now that as president of the National Party and Simon as the leader, we pay a lot more attention to the young Nats than they really paid to us. And it's not that not that we're trying to shut down the young Nats now. We're actually really trying to foster them, because the essence of political parties are about ideas. And it's about the people and it's about the ideas. And unless we really, encourage them to do that as 18-year-olds or 21-year-olds, how are we going to get people in a party, interested in their 30s or 40s? It actually is the opportunity, same as when I joined, was when people are young and you can really grab their imaginations. So that was all good. Now, my family didn't have a political history. My parents didn't. They weren't actually very involved in politics, or certainly not involved in the National Party. In fact, I think my father, who died a few years ago, was a bit more suspicious that the National really was just interfering too much in the economy. And his own father had actually started an urban party back in 1936 to when the other parties were scrapping, and Labor won that election largely as a result, Paul Goldsmith absolutely assures me, largely as a result of this political party that my grandfather formed, which stole enough votes to allow Labor to get elected. And then the National Party after that had to form as a reaction to the fact that they'd lost the election. But of course, even that didn't go particularly well, because the one thing I remember my grandfather saying was that yes, he was very passionate about this, and he'd given the party £1,000, gave it to the treasurer, and then the treasurer ran off with the money. So it wasn't a very auspicious start, and I thought his luck in business was a bit better than that, thank heavens. But you start in politics as a young man. I never wanted to be Prime Minister. I know John Key often said that he wanted to be Prime Minister when he was 15 or 14, and good on him, because he actually did exactly what I would advise any candidate: get out there, do something else, see if you're still interested in it, and come back to it. Some of them take my advice, some of them don't. Some of them change their minds. I know Simon Upton now, who some of you will know, says, he thinks it was a bit of a mistake to go into politics so young. And I actually say, well, I don't think so. I mean, I advised him not to, whenever it was, 40 years ago. But I actually think he was very successful. And he's had a big impact, both in New Zealand and internationally. How can that not be something that actually was a good decision for him to make? And if he'd waited 3 years or 10 years, who knows if actually he would have still had that same enthusiasm. So I say, just to our candidates, if you're ready now, go now. Don't worry about getting the right sort of CV, because again, it's a bit like Muldoon and My Young Nats. They may not pay too much attention to it anyway. So, but certainly one of the most important things is getting the right candidates. And I know, again, from the Australian experience, and I'll talk about that because it's a little less embarrassing than some of our New Zealand ones, but they basically, they picked a couple of candidates without due diligence, and people went back and looked at their social media from a few years ago, found some really bad comments, and suddenly, the campaign was sidetracked for a few days by the fact that the media were waiting for them to get rid of these candidates because they were such an embarrassment. And that's the risk with people that you don't know. So I always like to vet people pretty closely. And one of the things I usually ask candidates is, how well do you cope with ambiguity? And it's a really interesting experience to see what their answer is, because that's what politics is. It's all about ambiguity. It's not about absolutes, because the absolute keeps changing and people's opinions keep changing, and you can't be certain about stuff. You can't, and I've never met a candidate who's certain that they're going to win. They always start, well, maybe John Key actually. Well, maybe John Key. Yeah, maybe John Key actually. But all the rest of them, they start getting speed wobbles. Even if they're in safe seats and everything's going well, they start thinking, that somehow they're just not going to do as well as you'd expect. And I think that there's a fair degree then of just simple humanity in that. And I think that if our candidates display that, then actually that's really good, because it encourages them to work harder, to actually do more, because they can't be certain. And that ambiguity is actually quite important. But, we have a candidates college now. We've had that for over 10 years. And that's proven to be very successful at explaining to people what politics is, really letting them know what the life of an MP does consist of, and it's not quite the same as they think, and how long it takes for people to actually get, to a senior position. And I was reading actually an article that was written about John Key, and he said quite rightly that he thought it'd take 10 to 15 years to be in politics before he could lead the National Party, and that I think the age he then said he might be 58 when he became the leader of the party. Well, actually, serendipity says right place, right time, and you get to do it. And I think that's it's not about planning your career out. I say to our candidates now, look, it's likely you might be in Parliament for 10 to 12, maybe 15 years, but the days of politicians coming in and spending 30 years in Parliament is probably over. You'll be the exception rather than the rule. And even in our National Party caucus now, we have only a handful of people who were there before 2008. And that's pretty remarkable. We got 10 new people came in at the last election in 2017. We've had about 4 since then. So 14, a quarter of our caucus came in 2017 or 2018 or 2019. So they've only been there for a year and a half. And this handful of people have been there a while longer. So, you know, I just think that's where politics is. Wherever you look in the world, people are not looking for that long political career necessarily. They've done something, and some of them are looking as John did. Okay, what am I going to do now? Oh, look, it's got to be a lot easier being the chairman of ANZ Bank than being the Prime Minister. Well, not quite. And you know, as a director of a public company, my goodness, there is a lot of concerns that you have to be really mindful of, and there's not a quiet moment around a board table anymore. You're driven by your own shareholders, but you're also driven by all that other corporate responsibility that is there, and the publicity that you might cop. So, well, it's great to be here in Rotary. This is a voluntary organisation, just like the National Party. We're not as old. We're not 99 years old, but we are 83, as James said. We have about 25,000 members in the last couple of years, and one of the markers I've said to people wanting to go to selection is you've got to have at least as many members this year by the time you go to selection as you had at the end of last year. We want to build our membership because our members are absolutely, the core of everything that we do. And, members partly because they provide the finances. In Australia, political parties are state funded, so they get a couple of dollars a vote, basically, for their efforts, and that pays for the secretariat. But for New Zealanders, and they raise a lot of money alongside that, and there are no spending limits, so they can spend much as they like. And third parties frequently do that. So third parties spend money. You go to Australia during an election campaign, and you'll just be inundated with advertising on the TV and on the radio. A lot of it negative, but that's a bit more robust system, I think, in Australia. But yeah, it's my responsibility to make sure that we raise enough money for our campaigns and that runs well. And I think that we do. We've set up a foundation about 5 years ago. I've been president for 10 years, so I went to Australia 6 years ago actually, and visited Menzies House in Canberra, which is was a model for me to say, okay, the National Party needs a home like this, and what would be more appropriate? So we set up a foundation. All the electorates have contributed to that, and a number of other people have bought this former residence of Sir Keith Holyoake, and we now have our office there, and we run our campaign from National House on Pipitea Street. And it's just so appropriate that should be where we run the campaign, because, at the end of the day, it's kind of at the core of everything that we do, being a political party. The party is, again, in the last 10 years, really broadened its outreach. So we now have a lot of special interest groups. We've always had a Blue-Greens party for about 20 years, but now we have interest groups for Indian community, for the Filipinos, for the Chinese, Koreans, and the Super Blues. Super Blues are a fantastic way of us connecting with a part of the demographic that actually supports us more than others do. And so all of those now, in opposition, you are it's the most democratic time in any political party, being in opposition. So everybody has their say, everybody's opinion is worth the same as everybody else's. And we're really, last year we had a Have Your Say campaign, and we took the results of that. Well over 10,000 people responded, and informed our members of what people were concerned about, and now we've developed a whole lot of policy documents, and we'll go ahead with getting those out there. So, what keeps presidents awake at night? Boundary changes and selections. And, there was a boundary change in 2014, about 5 months before the election, made it really difficult for us. And we had to actually hold John Key's selection off until that boundary was settled. So he wasn't selected until about 5 months before the election. And I hope it's not the same. I mean, the census was such a shambles that now the Electoral Commission doesn't know if it's going to have enough data to actually do a boundary change before the next election. And if it does, it will not be until April or May of next year. So we'll be back in exactly the same position. That we're selecting candidates now for next year. We'll start at the end of this month. And we won't actually know for sure that those candidates in that seat are going to stay the same. If there's too much of a change in the seat, we'll have to open it up again and reselect a candidate, sometime in May of next year. But, we've got a lot of active supporters in the National Party. Thousands of members actually go out there and run what we call the ground game. There's an air game, that's what you see on TV, that's the radio, that's the newspaper articles. But the ground game is about all of those hoardings that you see, the door knocking that gets done, the meetings and the mobile hoardings and all the rest of it. And that's what we need our members for, because it's more important in Australia and New Zealand than it is in other countries to actually have a really strong ground game. So we put a lot of money into that. There's actually, the electorate spend a lot of money getting the flyers out there, getting direct mail and so on. So all of those things are a bit different than in some other countries, but it's, that's what it's about. So, I mean, I hope that's helpful. Learn a little bit about, what is the strongest membership political party in the country, and I'm very proud to be the leader of that party. I'll hold off on the political messages because I know Simon's already given them.
Peter, stay there. Thank you very much. We've got time for just a couple of questions. Mark, I think the first two hands up were you two. On either side, Mark and then Peter.
Peter, thank you for your remarks. It's lovely. I was particularly taken by your discussion about vetting candidates. And there's been a big change in the last few years internationally. It's been more difficult to do proper vetting by parties to determine who are the right candidates. I'm thinking in particular of Trump and Johnson in the UK, which are not candidates that anyone would normally think of as properly vetted or ones that would be selected in the usual way. And if you have any observations about that in this context.
Gosh. Well, look, I was lucky enough to go to both the Republican National Convention, where Kerry was selected as the candidate, and then 4 years later, Donald Trump was selected as the candidate. And I could see there that the party had really changed in 4 years. And the people who were at that convention were blue-collar workers. I was sitting next to them in the bleachers. The people speaking were not blue-collar. They were the existing politicians. But the blue-collar people had turned out to support their man, Trump. And how he comes to be their man, I have no idea. But they figured they'd done their vetting of him. And, Boris Johnson, I guess, the same. I mean, their foibles and their weaknesses are known to people. The trick is if you select somebody and you don't know them, and then once they're selected, then all this stuff comes out, and you go, we'd never have selected them if that were the case. I mean, we've had to get rid of candidates, frankly, once they've been selected, who we didn't do proper due diligence on, and found that they had a real financial problem in their background, which was going to mean that they didn't win. So we just get rid of them. Within the rules, of course.
Last question, Peter.
My question's a wee bit about membership. You alluded to being the biggest membership party. Well, I know with Rotary, we've got declining membership. People are finding it harder to commit to things like that. I'm just curious whether your membership is at its highest, or what time it's been at its highest, and whether you have more members when you're in opposition or when you're in government.
That's really good. That's a really good question. No, our membership is at really its lowest point, and it's comparable with the Tory party in the UK, in terms of numbers, but actually we've got more members per head of population than the Tories have. So, but we used to have 200,000 members. We now have about 25,000. We had 400,000 voters for National when we had 200,000 members. So 1 in 2 people who voted for us were actually members. And people became members of the party before my time, because it was the social thing to do and everybody belonged. And that's what's changed, that actually you've disconnected the voting from the membership or attachment to a party. And so when you do that, is people, we hear, people actually switch their votes between elections or even make up their mind in the last 48 hours of an election. So to me, the important thing about membership is it enables us to communicate directly with our members and cut through the media so we can control the message. But also they are the ground force for us to distribute things, but also just to talk to their neighbours. Because if you're a member of Rotary, you're more likely to talk positively about Rotary than if you're not, because it's actually part of your passion. So it's very important for us, and our membership's been really pretty static for 10 years now, around that 25 to 30 level. No surprise, it goes up in election year, drops off post-election, and then builds up again in election year.
Peter, thank you. James, can I invite you? Great question, by the way, Peter. Come on up and express our appreciation.
I've heard Peter speak a number of times, and I learnt more today about the party than I have in 40 years. No, thank you, Peter. That was a concise, good, realistic, and very one-to-one conversation we had with you today, and we do appreciate that. We know you come to Wellington often, and there's always a lunch here for you on Mondays if you're free. We have a small little gift for you. On behalf of everyone, thank you.